In 2023, Credit Suisse collapsed. One of the largest banks in the world, a bank that had stood for over 160 years, simply ceased to exist. And when journalists started digging through the wreckage, they found something fascinating. Client lists that read like a who's who of the world's most wanted, drug cartels, arms dealers, sanctioned oligarchs, African dictators who had stolen billions from their own people. And here's the thing, nobody was surprised. Not really. Because if you know anything about how Switzerland actually works, this wasn't a scandal. It was just Tuesday. Switzerland, the land of chocolate, watches, and pristine alpine lakes. A country so clean, so orderly, so neutral that it feels like it was designed in a laboratory. The Red Cross was born here. The United Nations has its European headquarters here. When countries go to war, Switzerland hosts the peace talks. It's the world's good guy, the adult in the room, the one country that never picks a side. And that, all of it, is a lie. Not the chocolate part. The chocolate is real. But the neutrality, the clean hands, the idea that Switzerland stayed out of every major conflict for 500 years because of mountains and moral superiority, that's one of the most successful branding operations in the history of civilization. Because Switzerland wasn't neutral. Switzerland was useful. And there's a massive difference between the two. Today, we're going to tear apart the most carefully constructed national myth in Europe. We're going to follow the money, and there's a lot of money, from Napoleon's wars to Hitler's gold vaults, from Cold War dictators to modern-day tax evaders. And by the end, you'll understand something that most people never think about. Switzerland wasn't spared by wars. It was spared because of wars. Every single one of them made Switzerland richer, more powerful, and more untouchable. This is the real story of why Switzerland was never invaded. And I promise you, it's nothing like what you've been told. Let's start with the fairy tale, because every good lie begins with a story people want to believe. If you've ever read anything about Swiss neutrality, you've probably heard the legend of Wilhelm Tell, the brave mountain man who shot an apple off his son's head to defy a tyrant. It's a beautiful story. It's also almost certainly fiction, but it captures something real about the Swiss self-image. We are free people, mountain people, people who bow to no one. And for a long time, that image kind of worked. The Swiss Confederation was born in 1291, or so the legend goes, when three tiny mountain communities decided they'd had enough of Habsburg rule and formed an alliance. Over the next 2 centuries, they fought off various invaders, mostly through sheer stubbornness and the enormous advantage of defending narrow mountain passes against armies that were used to fighting on flat ground. By the 1500s, the Swiss had built a reputation as some of the most ferocious soldiers in Europe. So ferocious, in fact, that they started exporting their skills. Swiss mercenaries became the most sought-after fighters on the continent. The Pope's Swiss Guard, those guys in the colorful Renaissance uniforms you see at the Vatican, they're not decorative. They're the last remnant of a tradition where Swiss soldiers were literally rented out to the highest bidder. And here's the first crack in the neutrality myth. Switzerland's military reputation wasn't built on defense. It was built on selling violence to other people. The Swiss didn't stay out of wars. They fought in everyone else's wars for money. It was one of the country's biggest industries for 300 years. But something changed in 1515. At the Battle of Marignano, a Swiss mercenary force was crushed by the French. It was a devastating defeat, and it forced Switzerland to rethink its entire strategy. If they couldn't be the strongest military power in Europe, they needed a different edge, a different product. And this is where the real story begins. Because Switzerland didn't choose neutrality out of principle. It chose neutrality because neutrality was more profitable than war. Think about that for a second. We're told Switzerland is neutral because the Swiss are peace-loving people who respect international law and believe in diplomacy. The reality is that Switzerland looked at the European chessboard and made a cold, calculated decision. We make more money as the middleman than as a player, and they were right. Spectacularly, disgustingly right. Now let's talk about Napoleon, because Napoleon is the key to understanding everything that came after. In 1798, Napoleon invaded Switzerland, just walked right in. So much for the impenetrable mountain fortress. The French army took the country in a matter of weeks. Napoleon abolished the old Swiss Confederation and replaced it with something called the Helvetic Republic, basically a French puppet state. And this should have been the end of the story. Switzerland was conquered, occupied, and absorbed into the French Empire, just like dozens of other European territories. Game over. Except it wasn't, because Napoleon did something nobody expected. After a few years of occupation, he looked at Switzerland and realized he had a problem. The Swiss were ungovernable. They kept rebelling, the mountain terrain made control expensive, and, most importantly, a conquered Switzerland was worthless to Napoleon. See, Napoleon didn't just need territory, he needed money. He was fighting wars on multiple fronts, and wars are expensive. And Switzerland, even back then, was already becoming what it would fully become in the 20th century, a financial hub, a place where money could move quietly across borders without too many questions being asked. So in 1803, Napoleon did something brilliant. He gave Switzerland back its independence, sort of. He created the Act of Mediation, which restored most of Swiss self-governance while keeping Switzerland firmly in France's sphere of influence. He didn't need to own Switzerland. He needed Switzerland to function. And here's the genius of it. By giving Switzerland its freedom, Napoleon turned it into something far more valuable than a conquered province. He turned it into a neutral buffer state between France, Austria, and the Italian states, a place where all sides could do business, even while they were at war with each other. Napoleon essentially invented modern Swiss neutrality, not the Swiss. Napoleon. He looked at this small mountain country and saw not a prize to be won, but a tool to be used. And the Swiss? They learned the lesson perfectly. When Napoleon fell in 1815, the Swiss sent diplomats to the Congress of Vienna, the peace conference that redrew the map of Europe, and made their pitch. They told the great powers exactly what Napoleon had already figured out. You need us to be neutral, not for our sake, for yours. The argument was simple. Europe was a continent of rival empires. France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, all constantly scheming against each other. Having a neutral zone in the middle, a place where diplomats could meet, where money could be stored, where deals could be made away from prying eyes. That was valuable to everyone, and it worked. The Congress of Vienna formally recognized Swiss neutrality in 1815, not because the Swiss were morally superior, not because of the mountains, because the great powers of Europe decided that a neutral Switzerland served their interests. This is the dirty secret at the heart of Swiss neutrality. It was never Switzerland's choice alone. It was a deal, a transaction. Switzerland offered a service, discretion, stability, a safe place for money and secrets, and the great powers agreed to leave it alone in exchange. And for the next 100 years, Switzerland perfected the service. While Europe tore itself apart in wars, revolutions, and colonial adventures, Switzerland quietly built the most sophisticated banking system in the world, a system designed from the ground up for one purpose: to be useful to people who had things to hide. Now, if you're finding this interesting, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because we're about to get into the part of this story that most people have never heard, and it only gets darker from here. Let's jump to 1914, the First World War. The war that killed 17 million people and redrew the map of the world. Switzerland stayed neutral. Of course it did. But neutral didn't mean uninvolved. Neutral meant open for business. During World War I, Switzerland became the go-to intermediary for both sides. The Allies and the Central Powers both used Swiss banks to move money, Swiss companies to trade goods, and Swiss territory for espionage. Zurich and Geneva were crawling with spies from every nation in Europe. The Swiss government knew this and tolerated it, because every spy who operated on Swiss soil spent money on Swiss soil. But it went deeper than that. Swiss manufacturers sold precision instruments, machine parts, and other goods to both sides of the conflict. Swiss banks handled financial transactions that would have been illegal or impossible in the warring countries. And Swiss insurance companies, this is a detail most people miss, insured ships and cargo for both the Allies and the Central Powers simultaneously. Switzerland wasn't sitting out the war. It was profiting from the war. Every bullet fired, every ship sunk, every factory destroyed. All of it generated financial activity that flowed through Swiss institutions. And when the war ended in 1918, Switzerland emerged richer and more powerful than before. While the rest of Europe was burying its dead and counting its debts, Switzerland had a banking system flush with cash from both sides of the conflict. But World War I was just the rehearsal. The real performance, the act that would define Switzerland for the next century, was World War II. And this is where the story gets genuinely dark. Let's set the scene. It's 1939. Hitler has invaded Poland. Europe is about to be consumed by the most destructive war in human history. 50 million people will die. Entire countries will be erased and redrawn. The Holocaust will murder 6 million Jews and millions of others. And Switzerland? Switzerland is surrounded, literally. By 1940, Germany controls everything to the north and east. Italy, Germany's ally, controls everything to the south. France has fallen. Switzerland is a tiny island of supposed neutrality in the middle of a fascist ocean. So why didn't Hitler invade? He had plans for it. Operation Tannenbaum, a detailed military strategy for conquering Switzerland. The Wehrmacht could have done it. The Swiss army, despite its reputation, would have been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the German war machine. But Hitler never gave the order. And the reason, the real reason, not the one in the textbooks, is money. By 1940, Switzerland had made itself indispensable to the Nazi war effort. Not with soldiers, not with weapons, with banking. Here's how it worked. Nazi Germany was looting Europe on an industrial scale. Gold from the central banks of conquered nations. Gold from the teeth of Holocaust victims. Artwork stolen from Jewish families. Cash seized from occupied territories. All of this wealth needed to go somewhere. It needed to be laundered, converted, and made usable on the international market. And the only place in Europe that could do that was Switzerland. The Swiss National Bank, not some shady private institution, the actual central bank of Switzerland, bought Nazi gold throughout the war. Tons of it, literally tons. They knew where it came from. They had to know. When gold bars arrive, stamped with the markings of central banks from countries that Germany has just invaded, you don't need to be a detective to figure out what happened. But it gets worse. The Swiss didn't just buy the gold. They converted it. They melted down bars that had markings from looted central banks and re-stamped them as Swiss gold. They essentially laundered the Nazi gold supply, giving Germany clean currency that could be used to buy critical war materials, tungsten from Portugal, oil from Romania, iron ore from Sweden. That kept the German war machine running. Without Swiss banks, the Nazi economy would have faced a serious problem. Looted gold is worthless if you can't spend it. Swiss banks made it spendable. And it wasn't just the central bank. Private Swiss banks, names you would recognize, names that still exist today, opened accounts for senior Nazi officials. They provided safe deposit boxes for stolen artwork. They managed investments for people who were actively committing genocide. Now the Swiss will tell you they had no choice. They were surrounded by Axis powers. They had to cooperate or face invasion. And there's a grain of truth to that. Switzerland was in a genuinely precarious position. But here's what undermines that defense completely. Switzerland didn't just cooperate with Germany, it cooperated with Germany enthusiastically, and it profited enormously. During the war, the Swiss National Bank purchased approximately 1.7 billion Swiss francs worth of gold from Nazi Germany. That's in 1940s money. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking about tens of billions in today's dollars. And the private banks? Those numbers have never been fully disclosed. But the gold wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what happened to the people. During the Holocaust, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees tried to flee through Switzerland. Some made it, many didn't. In 1942, Switzerland closed its borders to Jewish refugees, with the police chief famously declaring that the boat was full. Thousands of people were turned back at the border and sent to their deaths. And while Switzerland was closing its doors to living Jews, it was opening its vaults to dead ones. Jewish families across Europe, sensing what was coming, had deposited their savings in Swiss banks throughout the 1930s. It was supposed to be insurance, a safe place for their money in case the worst happened. And the worst did happen. Millions of account holders were murdered in the Holocaust. After the war, when survivors and their descendants came to Swiss banks to claim these accounts, the banks did something breathtaking. They demanded death certificates for people who had been murdered in gas chambers, in camps where no records were kept. The banks knew perfectly well that these certificates didn't exist. That was the point. For decades, Swiss banks sat on billions of dollars in dormant accounts belonging to Holocaust victims, collecting fees, earning interest, and refusing to acknowledge that the money existed. When pressed, they claimed they couldn't find the accounts. When pushed harder, they claimed the accounts had been closed. When confronted with evidence, they claimed banking secrecy prevented them from sharing information. It was theft, systematic institutional theft from the victims of genocide, and it continued for 50 years. This is what Swiss neutrality actually looked like during and after World War II. Not a principled stand for peace, a business decision. Germany was a client. The looted gold was a product. The dormant accounts were a bonus. And neutrality was the brand that made it all possible. Because here's the thing about neutrality. Real neutrality would mean treating both sides equally. But Switzerland didn't treat both sides equally. Switzerland treated both sides profitably. There's a difference. When Allied bombers accidentally dropped bombs on the Swiss city of Schaffhausen in 1944, Switzerland demanded and received compensation from the United States. Fair enough. It was an accident and Switzerland was neutral. But when confronted about laundering Nazi gold, Switzerland claimed it was just being neutral. You can't have it both ways. You can't demand the protections of neutrality while selling services to a genocidal regime. But Switzerland did have it both ways for decades, because the post-war world needed Switzerland just as much as the wartime world had. And that brings us to the Cold War, which is where Swiss neutrality evolved from a wartime survival strategy into something even more sophisticated, a global service industry for people who needed to hide money. When the war ended in 1945, you might think Switzerland would face consequences, and briefly it looked like it might. The Allies knew about the Nazi gold. They knew about the dormant accounts. They were angry. In 1946, the Allies pressured Switzerland into the Washington Agreement, which was supposed to force the Swiss to return looted assets. Switzerland agreed to pay 250 million Swiss francs, a fraction of what had passed through its banks, and the matter was considered settled. 250 million. For years of laundering genocide money. It was a parking ticket for a serial killer, but the Allies didn't push harder, and the reason tells you everything about how the world actually works. The Cold War had begun. The United States and the Soviet Union were now the main rivals, and both of them needed Switzerland. The Americans needed Swiss banks to move money for covert operations, funding anti-communist movements, paying informants, financing regime changes in countries across the developing world. The CIA used Swiss bank accounts extensively throughout the Cold War. It was convenient, discreet, and, thanks to Swiss banking secrecy laws, virtually untraceable. The Soviets needed Switzerland too, though for different reasons. Swiss neutrality made it a useful meeting ground for back-channel diplomacy. And Soviet officials, like officials everywhere, appreciated having a place to stash money that their own government couldn't track. So Switzerland got a pass. Again. Just like after Napoleon. Just like after World War I. The great powers looked at Switzerland and made the same calculation they'd been making for 200 years. A useful Switzerland is worth more than a punished Switzerland. And with that pass, Switzerland entered its golden age. The period from 1945 to roughly 1990 was when Swiss banking became what most people think of today, a synonym for secrecy, discretion, and the quiet management of vast, often questionable, wealth. The foundation of this system was the Swiss Banking Secrecy Act of 1934. This law made it a criminal offense, not a civil matter, a criminal offense, for a banker to reveal client information. If a Swiss banker told anyone who held an account at their bank, they could go to prison. Think about that. In most countries, banking secrecy is a courtesy. In Switzerland, it was a law backed by prison time. And this wasn't some accident of legislation. It was a product designed for a specific market, people who had money they didn't want anyone to know about. And the customers came. They came from everywhere. Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator of the Philippines, who stole an estimated $10 billion from his country while his people starved. Where did the money go? Swiss banks. Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, who plundered his country so thoroughly that one of the most resource-rich nations on earth became one of the poorest. His personal fortune, estimated at $5 billion, was managed by Swiss banks. Jean-Claude Duvalier, the dictator of Haiti, Baby Doc, who lived in luxury while Haiti descended into desperate poverty. Swiss bank accounts. Sani Abacha, the military dictator of Nigeria, who looted roughly $5 billion from the country's oil revenues. Swiss banks held hundreds of millions of his stolen funds. The pattern was always the same. A dictator steals from his people. The money flows to Switzerland. Swiss banks ask no questions, provide impeccable service, and collect their fees. When the dictator falls, and they usually do, eventually, the money stays in Switzerland. The banks claim they can't return it without proper legal proceedings, which take years or decades. And this wasn't marginal. This wasn't a few rogue bankers. This was the Swiss banking industry's core business model, a significant portion of Switzerland's enormous wealth. And Switzerland is one of the richest countries per capita in the world, came from managing money that was stolen, evaded, laundered, or hidden. Swiss GDP per capita has consistently ranked among the highest in the world. The banking sector accounts for a massive share of the Swiss economy, and a huge chunk of that banking sector was built on one service: helping rich people hide money from their governments, their creditors, their ex-spouses, and the law. It wasn't just dictators either. Wealthy individuals from every democratic country in the world used Swiss banks to evade taxes. A French businessman could walk into a bank in Geneva, open a numbered account, not even a name, just a number, deposit millions, and the French tax authorities would never know. An American industrialist could do the same in Zurich. A German heiress could do it in Basel. The Swiss banking system was, for decades, the world's largest tax evasion machine. And Switzerland defended it fiercely, arguing that taxation was a matter between a citizen and their government, and Switzerland had no obligation to help foreign governments collect taxes from their own citizens, which is technically true, and also morally bankrupt. But Switzerland didn't just cater to tax evaders and dictators. It also served as the financial hub for some of the most controversial transactions of the 20th century. Arms deals, commodity trades with sanctioned regimes, payments for hostage releases, intelligence operations. If money needed to move quietly, it moved through Switzerland. During the apartheid era in South Africa, when the country was under international sanctions, Swiss banks and trading companies were among the most active in helping South Africa circumvent those sanctions. Swiss companies traded South African gold and diamonds, and Swiss banks managed South African government funds, while the rest of the world was trying to isolate the apartheid regime. During the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s, when the Reagan administration was secretly selling weapons to Iran and funneling the profits to Nicaraguan rebels, both of which were illegal, the money moved through Swiss bank accounts. Every time there was a deal that couldn't be done in the open, Switzerland was there. Not because Switzerland was evil, but because Switzerland had built an entire economy around being the place where those deals happened. And nobody invaded, nobody sanctioned, nobody punished, because everyone was using the service. This is the ultimate irony of Swiss neutrality. Switzerland wasn't neutral at all. It was the most connected country in the world, connected to every dirty deal, every hidden fortune, every secret transaction. But it maintained the illusion of neutrality because that illusion was the product. The moment Switzerland stopped being neutral, the money would leave, and the money was everything. Now, by the 1980s, the walls started to crack, and the crack came from an unexpected place: the past. In 1995, a Swiss bank security guard named Christoph Mailly was doing his rounds at the Union Bank of Switzerland when he noticed something unusual. The bank was shredding documents, a lot of documents, and when Mailly looked closer, he realized what they were: records related to World War II-era transactions, records that could reveal what the bank had done with accounts belonging to Holocaust victims. Mailly did something incredibly brave and incredibly Swiss, which is to say, totally against the rules. He took some of the documents and gave them to a Jewish organization. The scandal exploded. Suddenly, 50 years of carefully buried history came rushing to the surface. The dormant accounts, the Nazi gold, the turned-away refugees, all of it. The World Jewish Congress launched a campaign demanding accountability. The United States Congress held hearings. Swiss banks were threatened with sanctions if they didn't cooperate with investigations. And for the first time in its modern history, Switzerland found itself on the defensive. The banks tried their usual playbook: deny, delay, claim secrecy. But this time, it didn't work. The political pressure was too intense. In 1998, the two largest Swiss banks, UBS and Credit Suisse, agreed to pay $1.25 billion to settle claims from Holocaust survivors and their families. $1.25 billion for 50 years of sitting on dead people's money. Again, a fraction of what was actually owed. The total value of dormant Holocaust-era accounts has never been fully established, but estimates range from $7 to $20 billion. The settlement covered a fraction of that. But the Holocaust scandal did something more important than any settlement could. It pierced the myth. For the first time, the world saw Swiss neutrality not as a principled stance, but as a brand that had been used to cover some of the most cynical financial dealings of the 20th century. And once the myth was pierced, other scandals followed. In the 2000s, the focus shifted from World War II to tax evasion. In 2007, a former UBS banker named Bradley Birkenfeld walked into the U.S. Department of Justice and started talking. He revealed that UBS had been actively helping American citizens evade taxes, not just passively holding accounts, but sending bankers to the United States to recruit clients, advising them on how to hide assets, and creating elaborate offshore structures to keep money invisible from the IRS. The scale was staggering. UBS alone had helped thousands of Americans hide an estimated $20 billion from the U.S. government. And UBS wasn't unique. It was just the one that got caught first. The United States government went nuclear. They threatened to indict UBS, which would have effectively destroyed the bank, unless it cooperated. In 2009, UBS agreed to pay $780 million in fines and, crucially, to hand over the names of American clients with hidden accounts. This was unprecedented. Swiss banking secrecy, the foundation on which the entire system was built, had been breached. A Swiss bank had given client names to a foreign government. The thing that was literally a criminal offense in Switzerland was now happening under government pressure, and it didn't stop with UBS. Over the next several years, a dozen Swiss banks paid fines and handed over client information to the United States. Credit Suisse paid $2.6 billion in 2014. Other banks paid hundreds of millions each. The era of absolute Swiss banking secrecy was over. Or was it? Because here's the thing about Switzerland. It adapts. It always adapts. That's the real genius of the Swiss system. It doesn't fight the tide. It redirects it. When banking secrecy started to crumble, Swiss banks didn't collapse. They evolved. They shifted from secrecy to wealth management, a euphemism for the same service with more paperwork. They moved operations to Singapore, Dubai, and other jurisdictions with fewer questions. They created new structures, trusts, foundations, shell companies, that achieved the same result as a numbered account, but with more legal cover. And Switzerland itself adapted. The government signed information-sharing agreements with other countries, agreeing to exchange financial data, but with so many loopholes and exceptions that the practical impact was limited. Switzerland joined international anti-money laundering initiatives, but enforcement remained, let's say, gentle. The product changed, the brand evolved, but the fundamental business model, being the place where money goes to hide, survived. And that brings us to the present, to Credit Suisse, which I mentioned at the beginning. In 2022, a massive leak of client data, the Swiss secrets, revealed that Credit Suisse held accounts for human traffickers, drug dealers, corrupt politicians, and sanctioned individuals from around the world. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't World War II. This was happening right now in the 21st century in a bank that was supposedly operating under the strictest regulatory oversight in Swiss history. Credit Suisse collapsed in 2023, absorbed by UBS in an emergency rescue. But the collapse wasn't because of the dirty money, it was because of bad bets and mismanagement. The dirty money part? That was just business as usual. So let's pull back and answer the question we started with. Why was Switzerland never invaded? The answer isn't mountains. Yes, the Alps are impressive. Yes, they make invasion difficult. But plenty of mountainous countries have been invaded throughout history. Afghanistan has mountains. Nepal has mountains. Georgia has mountains. Mountains slow armies down. They don't stop them. The answer isn't the Swiss army. The Swiss military is well trained, and the country's defensive preparations are genuinely impressive. Bridges wired to blow, tunnels ready to collapse, a citizen militia with weapons at home. But against a determined great power, Napoleonic France, Nazi Germany, Cold War America or Russia, the Swiss army would buy time, not victory. The answer isn't even neutrality, at least not in the way we usually understand it. Switzerland doesn't stay out of conflicts because it believes in peace. It stays out of conflicts because it makes more money that way. The real answer is this. Switzerland was never invaded because Switzerland made itself too useful to invade. It positioned itself as the world's back office, the place where dirty deals get clean, where stolen money finds a home, where enemies can do business with each other through intermediaries, where secrets are kept for a price. Every powerful country, every powerful individual, every powerful institution had something to lose if Switzerland fell. Invade Switzerland and your own money disappears. Your own secrets get exposed. Your own back-channel deals collapse. No rational actor would destroy the one place in the world that serves everyone equally. Equally, that is, in exchange for a fee. Switzerland didn't survive by being good. It survived by being necessary. And that's a far more cynical and far more honest explanation than anything in the tourist brochures. And here's the part that should really bother you. Switzerland is one of the richest, most stable, most democratic countries in the world. It has universal healthcare, world-class education, beautiful cities, low crime, high quality of life. By almost every measure, Switzerland is a success story. But that success was built on a foundation of moral compromise that most Swiss people don't talk about. The wealth that built those beautiful cities came, in part, from managing stolen money. The stability that Switzerland enjoys came from making deals with the worst people in every generation. Napoleon, the Nazis, Cold War dictators, modern kleptocrats. Does that make Switzerland evil? No. It makes Switzerland honest. Honest about something that every other country pretends isn't true. Power runs on money, and money doesn't care about morality. Every country makes deals it isn't proud of. Switzerland just made it a national industry. The Swiss understand something that most of us don't want to admit. In a world of empires and wars, the safest place to be isn't the strongest. It's the most useful. And usefulness in international relations often means doing things that nobody wants to talk about. So the next time you see a picture of a Swiss mountain village, all clean streets and flower boxes and church bells, remember what paid for it. Remember the gold bars with the serial numbers filed off. Remember the dormant accounts of people who died in gas chambers. Remember the dictators' billions sitting in numbered accounts while their country starved. Switzerland is a beautiful country, but beauty has a price. And for 500 years, Switzerland has been very, very good at making other people pay it. If this video changed the way you think about neutrality, drop a comment. I'd love to know which part hit you hardest. And if you want to understand how other countries play the same game in different ways, subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We pull back the curtain on the stories that the world would rather keep hidden. I'll see you in the next one.